Welcome everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on social mobility. Really looking forward to today's session. We've got a great lineup of panelists. I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting and very in-depth session. Just a reminder, if this is your first IEC webinar, although I can't think there's many people of our membership who haven't tuned into one yet, of all the ones that we've been doing through the pandemic. We like to make this as interactive as possible. So on the platform that we're using, there is a questions box. Please pop your questions into there as we go along. We've left time at the end of the session where I'll be able to present those questions to our panelists. So please use that facility. Just a reminder that we do record this, so if by any chance you've got to drop off because you've got the next Zoom meeting to join, or actually you want to share the information on this recording with your colleagues, then please do use that link. We will get it up on our website normally by the end of today. If not, it'll be tomorrow morning. So let's get straight into the content. What I'll do first of all is hand over to Nick. Really thankful for your support in creating this webinar, Nick, and Nick's going to just introduce the panelists and take us from here.
Great, thanks Stephen, and good afternoon everyone. I'm really delighted also to welcome Claire, Andre and Tim, who I'll bring into the conversation shortly. What I'd love to do just for the first 10 minutes is just set the context for the discussion that we'll be having with Claire, Tim, Andre and Stephen, and then as Stephen said, we'll open it up to the attendees this afternoon as well. I thought it might be useful just to touch briefly on why this topic matters. Why are we focusing on socioeconomic background and race particularly, and diversity and inclusion in general? Then to address the question we at the Bridge Group get asked most often, which is who are we talking about? When we talk about socioeconomic background, how do we measure this? Because one of the points I know colleagues and I are keen to leave you with this afternoon is that data is absolutely key to exploring this area. So unless we can be precise about who we're talking about, what data we're collecting, we might stumble at the first hurdle. Then to share with you a bit about what's happening, to share with you some slides with some of these key data points on, and then some areas of practice which might then, as I say, provide a springboard into the discussion with the panel. And I think on this topic, so at the Bridge Group, we over the last 11 or 12 years have been focusing on diversity and inclusion with a particular focus on socioeconomic background. And I won't launch into an overture about us. There's a website that has that if you're interested to find out more. But we're finding particularly that three different issues converge when we talk about this topic. The first, of course, is equality. Most of us want to work in an organization where it's talent and hard work that get you ahead, not your background, your race, your gender, your sexuality. And too often that's not the case, as I intend to demonstrate to you this afternoon. So clearly equality is the pillar of our conversation this afternoon. Productivity too is the second area, accessing the best talent, ensuring that once people access your organization, they're included and can thrive. So equality, productivity, and also increasingly we're finding issues around public trust, whether it's politics, business, or the media. We find public trust is in decline, and who's at the top, who runs organizations, of course, is intimately connected to that. So we're finding lots of issues converging around this topic of socioeconomic diversity and inclusion. And those things, of course, and this will be on your mind, have all been exposed and exacerbated by the effects and the ongoing effects of the pandemic. And indeed, lots of other things that have been happening in the meantime. The effects of Brexit, for example, the momentum that has been provided by the Black Lives Matter movement. All of these things are intersecting and data is key in understanding them. So I'd like to provide you just with a bit of backdrop. I've got some slides which we'll share afterwards. And here I'm going to be drawing on some of the latest results from the annual survey at the ISE and some vignettes of the research that we've been doing at the Bridge Group. And then we'll hand over to our panel. So just to look briefly, and all of this information is available in the ISE survey, about organizations, the proportion of organizations that have targets for attracting diverse hires. So this is the percentage of organizations in the ISE response that have targets in each of these areas. Interestingly, looking back over the last few years, socioeconomic background has been increasing but there are still organisations who have or claim to have targets around socioeconomic background, but who are not measuring it in their own workforce. And I'll come to the issue of measurement in a second. And I raise this slide partly because, of course, as you look at these data, you'll start to be thinking about the relationships between these targets. And one thing we'll be exploring later this afternoon is the relationship particularly between socioeconomic background and race. And we'll be very careful not to conflate the two because, of course, they're very different. But we at the Bridge Group have increasingly come to the view that if an organisation wants to tackle diversity and inclusion with respect to race, ignoring socioeconomic background risks missing a really important piece of that jigsaw. And also, to land the point earlier on, and we try to avoid this as much as we can in our research, the packaging of BAME is increasingly unhelpful, or even, one might argue, deeply insulting. Wherever possible, we don't package all ethnic groups that are not white under one acronym. And we'll talk about that more shortly. So these are the organisations proportionately that have targets for attracting diverse hires across each of these areas. And then on the next slide, the ISE asked their members, what diversity strands do organisations need to address looking into the future? And here we see race and socioeconomic background much more prominent. I should also recognise here, of course, disability as a protected characteristic, though that's not an area of expertise that we have at the Bridge Group, and nor a particular focus of the session this afternoon. And the important thing, I think, in this slide is the way in which the question has been phrased. Diversity strands that you need to address. And here we've seen a really positive shift, partly created by the momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement, from narrative and talking about change and the importance of diversity to much increased pressure on action. And us being asked particularly, what works? What does the evidence say? And where should we be investing our resources? And that, of course, is the focus of our session this afternoon. And that's where, of course, the data is key. If we want to be robust and convincing in sharing what works, we need to be able to measure. And because I know it will be on lots of people's mind, I'll talk about this very briefly. We at the Bridge Group have done lots of work, including in partnership with colleagues who you'll meet shortly, on how we measure socioeconomic background. And I'm going to resist indulging myself by going into lots of detail here. But we've worked with the Social Mobility Commission to identify the three main questions that we would encourage all employers to ask of their applicants, their hires, and their wider workforce. The key question being the one at the top there, about the occupation of your main household earner at age 14. That question is most highly endorsed by us because of the three criteria that we've considered. Is it robust? Is it a good revealer of access to opportunities and relative disadvantage? Is it relevant? So clearly questions around school type and free school meals are less relevant to those educated outside of the UK. And is it relatable? Can we benchmark it sensibly to understand whether the data we're getting is positive or more negative? And that first question around occupation is used in the labour force survey and in the census. So we can start to understand how, for example, practicing solicitors in a particular firm compare to the wider population of solicitors in England. If you're interested in pursuing this journey of asking employees and hires and applicants, if you don't already, about their socioeconomic background, I'll share a link to some guidance shortly, which includes advice on how to increase response rates. And I know there'll be lots of people on the call who for many years have been asking these questions. Because when we have that data, we can start to understand things like what's the diversity of our application pool based on different hiring strands that we have in place. And here we can start to reveal some interesting trends. So the data, for example, on the next slide is data accumulated from 22 of the largest accountancy firms and looks at the school background of applicants in each area. And here we can start to see the way in which the data not only shows us that applicants are disproportionately from independent schools, the national benchmark being 7%, but that pattern looks very different depending on the area of the firm. We can start to generate insights which enable us to think meaningfully about action we might take. And also around seniority. Data is good at busting myths. And my favorite myth to bust often with data is the narrative that goes something like this. We're recruiting more diverse candidates at entry level, give us 10 or 20 years, and that will filter through the organization, and we will look much more diverse. All of the data that we've handled suggests that that's not going to be the case when we think about things like progression. So this is data from the report we published at the end of last year, looking at 12 large financial services organizations. And here we see the categories high, intermediate and low socioeconomic background that relate directly to that parental occupation question. And so we can see even at the junior levels, diversity of hiring is negatively benchmarked against the national, the higher SEB figure there being 32% nationally. But that it gets progressively worse as we go into more senior areas of the organizations. The patterning, of course, you know, looks very similar based on race and based on gender. We also can start to look at, and I know within the panel we'll be talking both about attracting applicants and then selecting applicants. We've looked at success ratios, so who is most likely to be successful in the application process based on socioeconomic background. This slide focuses on independent versus state schools. So this is showing what percentage applicants are more likely to be successful depending on whether they're from an independent or state school. So for example, at firm F, applicants from independent schools are just over a third, 34% more likely to be successful in the application process. At firm H, state school applicants unusually are more likely to be successful. These are all anonymized large financial services firms. So clearly the data here reveals big discrepancies between the organizations and enables us then to start to ask the question, what's the difference? What's making the difference here that some of the application processes appear to be more equal depending on the school background of applicants? In the next slide, and I'm hoping lots of this is useful fuel for our conversation to follow shortly, we look at some of these intersecting characteristics. So this again is data from 22 accountancy firms looking at the success rate amongst candidates from different backgrounds. So here we can see just over 2% of candidates who identify as having Black ethnicity are successful, compared to 9.5% of candidates who attended Oxbridge. And of course, you'll be looking at this thinking, clearly people are represented in multiple bars, but it helps us start to understand the things that make the difference. The background characteristics, that seem to relate most closely to being successful in the application process. Here we're getting closer to this sense of appreciating we don't experience our diversity characteristics in isolation. So we know, for example, in the data, that those who identify as having Black ethnicity are much less likely, for example, to have gone to an independent school, are much more likely to be from families with lower income. These are not value judgments, I should add, they're just truths from the data that we've handled. And I think once you begin to understand these dynamics, you can design much more effective interventions. And then to talk briefly about progression, because I think although the focus here is likely to be largely on this, there has been a welcome but disproportionate focus, we feel, on hiring at entry level and less focus on inclusion and progression. So just to highlight two pieces of evidence from our research. Firstly, a piece which certainly Tim and André on the call were involved in, and actually Claire, I think when you were based in the legal sector, it was you who catalysed this as well. A piece of work we published just over 2.5 years ago, looking at the progression of early career legal professionals, which showed that those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were much more likely, 75% more likely, to be in the top decile of performers across 8 leading law firms. But those same candidates were less likely to progress post-qualification and more likely to leave. Here, for the first time, was a really strong evidence base for a business case for the legal sector to be paying attention to this. And then in the graph below, which doesn't relate to the bullet points above, this is work in the financial services sector. We've looked at the progression gap. So how long does it take on average someone in the financial services sector to experience a promotion, a progression from one grade to the next one up? And we call this the progression gap. So it takes those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds on average a quarter, 25% longer to progress. Here we can start to do things like intersect different characteristics. So if we also here look at candidates, for example, lower socioeconomic background from Black heritage backgrounds, that gap increases again by another 3.5 months on average. So we're starting to understand who gets ahead, and through our qualitative work, how. And then to finish, before I introduce our panel, to return to some of the data from the ISE, which in this respect, again, is invaluable. Here are some of the things that the ISE membership are doing to attract more diverse candidates. And just to make a couple of points as you digest this information. The targeting of particular groups is top of these actions. And of course, that can become more complex around socioeconomic background, it being a less visible characteristic and it being a characteristic that people are less used to declaring. The running of outreach events and the changing universities visited is connected to my point here, which is that universities, and Stephen, I know you're going to talk a bit about this later, are your allies. Universities are, of course, under pressure to be supporting the graduate outcomes of students from underrepresented backgrounds, lower socioeconomic background, particular ethnic groups as well. So there is a meeting of motivations and of practice here as well. And then as we reflect briefly on selection approaches, so the same question, what are the approaches taken by organisations to improve diversity in selection? Here we see a range of things. Interestingly, the top two are not necessarily actions in their own right. Analysing the diversity outcomes of previous campaigns and monitoring diversity will eventually, of course, contribute to change, but may not affect it in their own right. And then I really hope with the panel we will come to the topic of unconscious bias. Certainly our view in the Bridge Group is that many of these biases are not unconscious. They are not meant to be unkind, but they are certainly not unconscious. So here are some of the examples of what employers predominantly are doing in this space. And then to finish, just to wrap up some of those headlines, which I know we'll come to in conversation. We know that diversity and inclusion, and indeed talent generally, is about people and the way we interact with each other. But data is absolutely key to understanding these things. And I know we're going to touch upon these various topics as we talk through this. And I might just conclude with that last bullet point about an integrated diversity and inclusion, the bold being deliberate. Integrated, meaning particularly for the work that we do between socioeconomic background and race, and diversity and inclusion, referring to my earlier point that actually diversity in itself may not lead to greater productivity, but match diversity and inclusion, and there's plenty of evidence that it does. So thanks for your attention, just as I've set the scene there. Let me now bring back Stephen, and introduce Tim Smith, who's a partner at BCLP, as I mentioned, has been instrumental in getting lots of our research off the ground. Welcome, Tim. Thanks for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome Claire England, who's head of D&I at JLL, the real estate firm, and André Flemmings, who has a background with Linklaters, with McFarland's, with Deutsche Bank, and is currently consulting and advising lots of organisations in this area. But his greatest accolade is that André is also a trustee of the Bridge Group. So Stephen, may I turn to you just first? I've shared there some of the ISE data. Give us a sort of reality check to kick off. Are your members genuinely focused on the intersection between these two areas, between socioeconomic background and race? Kick us off, please.
I think the positive answer is yes, and the short answer. If I go back when I sort of took over this job 8 years ago, I don't want to pour over more and more ISE data, but the data of the number of employers who are actually focused on social mobility at all was less than a fifth. And you've shown the numbers how much that has increased. And I think particularly over the last 12 to 24 months, that word intersectionality has become part of our lecture. More and more people are talking about it. I think it's something that everybody's kind of exploring. What does that mean? Getting more understanding. So on the positive side, yes, much more focus on this area. Many more employers saying they're investing in doing things. Maybe on the less positive side, I think some of the numbers you showed around, for example, how many organizations have a hard target in this area, only a fifth. I'd like to see that high, because that really shows, sort of how meaningful somebody's intent is in this space. And I think that's also reflected in the other number of ours that you showed, which is actually those where we asked employers, when we were basically saying, where do you need to do a lot more in this space? And it's interesting how the order of priorities then shifted, and social mobility came and race came much higher up the agenda. And I think that's employers recognizing that this is the area they're struggling more with, and need to find ways to do more and have more effective outcomes, I think.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And maybe, Andre, just reflecting on some of the kind of motivating factors underneath that shift that Stephen's described. What's your experience of why organisations are focusing more on this area?
I think there are a number of things. I think you touched on them as well in your opening, really. There's the element of the business case, the idea of having a diversity of thought and actually having candidates from more candidates from low socioeconomic groups or from ethnic minority backgrounds, in virtue of their experiences, will inject your talent pool with a very different set of perspectives on the challenges. And that's particularly the case at the professional services level, or indeed any of the sort of service level organisations that we are part of. I guess on top of that, there's also a recognition of, I guess, how important culture is to one's reputation, and also the social reputation that exists. I think, the current situation around BLM, immigration in the UK in particular, COVID-19, has definitely sharpened people's minds towards the importance of these factors. But I'd also say, certainly from the early careers side, the expectations of work from Generation Z. I think there are a plethora of other opportunities which are, in some respects, more attractive than the traditional sort of opportunities that are out there. And their expectation is that a firm has a purpose that actually has an impact, and is also positive in terms of its impact on the environment, our society at large, and also future generations. And so I think a lot of that has meant that, certainly at early careers levels and at lateral, there's a real driver to make sure, if you really want the best talent, you need to be leveraging your culture in the right sorts of ways. And that means having a culture where everyone can be a success, and there isn't a particular cookie cutter version of an individual that will be successful here and no other.
That's really helpful, thank you. And maybe just building on that, Tim, I sort of threw away the comment earlier about there being a focus on access, but much less on inclusion, sort of in early career, but more generally across careers. Is that fair? What's your view?
There's a number of different dimensions to it. I think, Nick, the first one is something that you touched on in your introduction. The two key statistics from some of the Bridge Group research with the legal sector were that candidates from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to be high performers, and also more likely to leave. And so if you wanted an economic argument for doing this, here are people that you've attracted, recruited, trained, and are just about to get a return on investment. And at that point, they're walking out the door because they don't feel that there's the right cultural fit within the organization. So if we can foster a culture of inclusivity, then the talent that we have attracted and trained is much more likely to stay and start to benefit the organization as a whole. I think there's also a factor from clients' purchasing power, that more and more clients are flexing their muscles and saying, we insist on having diverse teams working for us. That's not just diverse teams pitching to us, it's diverse teams working with us. And so far that's been experienced more around race and gender. And to a degree, I think socioeconomic background is the new kid on the block in diversity and inclusivity. But if the trajectory continues, I think there's every prospect that those clients who are asking for diverse teams, both racially and gender, are going to be saying the same for socioeconomic background. But I think the final point, and this is common, I know, to all of the panelists and various people that we speak to, is we shouldn't underestimate the fact that this is about equity and fairness, and no matter what sector you're represented in, there is an interest in equity and fairness, and we can all of us be agents for change in society by doing the right thing and getting our own house in order. And I know from various discussions that we've had on panels like this, that is something which drives people who take a keen interest in this. So those would be my thoughts around the importance of it.
Yeah, that's helpful, thank you. And I think, as you know, in lots of our research, we have this very contradictory narrative around clients, where on the one hand, to echo your comments, people will talk about clients demanding greater diversity, and that's typically rooted in race and gender, as you described. But then sometimes in the same paragraph, interviews will say, but we have to be careful who we put in front of clients, and that often is much more rooted in socioeconomic background. So from early career progression, Claire, maybe to move further sort of upstream, earlier on, as it were, when it comes to diversity, to what extent do people's kind of early perceptions of a profession matter? And I should think this question may feel particularly relevant given the sector you're currently working in real estate, but these perceptions that are formed at a very young age, what can employers be doing in that space?
Yeah, so we know, Nick, that people, students, young children are forming those views really early. And there's a video that I watch regularly, actually, which shows gender stereotypes playing out as early as age 7. So if we know that children are forming views as early as age 7 about careers and careers that are genderized, then we know that they're forming views of our profession, and indeed every single one of the panelists here today. I think in terms of what can you do around perception, engage with schools. So we've got an extensive communities program going out into schools early on to talk about careers. I think the build for me on that is, and something again that sticks in my mind, is people say you need to see it to be it. So whilst we're trying to drive diversity, take into schools people from diverse backgrounds to provide the role models for them, the role models that they can look up to that are in our professions today. I think the other thing that sticks with me from a few years back when I did work with Tim was one of the most powerful things we did to raise aspirations and break down perceptions of industry and whether it was an industry you could pursue was bring people into your businesses. Post-COVID, can I add? So what we had, one of the most simplest things we did was have a group of, I think they were aged 17-year-olds, so not as early as when you form perceptions, but aged 17-year-olds coming in for a morning. And these are people that from low socioeconomic groups, actually in Pimlico Academy, had never been into the City of London. And we knew that there was a girl that came into the building at the beginning and said, okay, I think my aspirations are to be a cleaner here. And in the space of 3 hours, interactive exercise and understanding of the profession, or understanding more about what the profession did and lawyers did, they then felt it was something attainable for them. So engage with schools, engage with young people, break down myths and provide them with role models that are like them that they can identify with.
Great, thanks, Claire. That's really helpful. And Stephen, maybe back to you and picking up on some of the points I made earlier around collecting data. Any thoughts to share on across different sectors, what the sort of challenges and opportunities are in relation to that?
Well, the first thing I'd say, I think your slides, Nick, you really made the case for collating data. I think you I've long admired a lot of the work the Bridge Group have done, because I think you're showing that this is the data that you can gather, and this is what it tells you. So, for example, we've had this conversation before around, we're now starting to see the evidence come through that says actually when you get this right, it improves business performance. I think we've all known, as Tim said, the moral case, and we've all kind of, I think there's been a lot of instinctive that this must make business sense, but actually your numbers are starting to prove it in the progression data, but also showing where the problems are. So I think there is a lot more that employers can be doing in this space, and that is actually realistically and robustly starting to gather the information. I still think there aren't enough employers asking at application stage, and again, you showed, there's just 3 pretty straightforward questions you can ask to start gathering this data, and then how people progress. Because we've not looked at this in depth for 2 or 3 years, but 2 or 3 years ago, we asked employers in one of our surveys, and we asked about progression and who was getting through the process, and it was interesting and alarming, because what that data showed is that on gender, for example, female graduates were maybe less likely to apply, but they were more likely to get through a selection process, which suggests that actually the process is working pretty well from that point of view. The data that we had on social mobility showed 2 things. One, that hardly anybody was gathering the data in the first place, which was a cause of concern. And those that did provide us with the data showed that those from a lower SEB background were actually a bit less likely to get through the selection process, which raised alarm bells around what was happening in selection. So yes, I think the evidence is there that actually there are ways to gather this information now and what you can do with it. I think one of the outputs of webinars like this and all the other stuff we're doing is really to encourage more and more employers to be focused on that analysis side and then making the improvements as a result of it.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. As I mentioned earlier to colleagues, there is some very precise guidance if you're trying to work your way through which questions to ask, how to phrase them, what to do with the data. There is free guidance available on that I can share as a part of follow-up to this. Let's shift gear a bit. All those comments have been extremely helpful to think about sort of practice. And André, I might just turn to you, given your experience in the graduate sort of hiring space, sort of practical things that recruiters can be doing, maybe in the attraction or the selection space.
Of course, I think Claire sort of said it very succinctly. I think starting before the graduate sort of window is always really, really helpful. And also, I'd say within that, having an integrated approach with your talent teams, as well as your D&I or CSR activity. Because I think that was one of the biggest things that I've seen at firms that doesn't always work. There's always a sense of this is the charitable stuff, this is the stuff that actually affects the firm, and this is what we do once people are in. And that's normally at a very high level and not necessarily sort of trickling down. So I think the work needs to be done in terms of the bottom-up approach. So what does the fact we have a target at the top actually mean for the way we onboard people or the way that we sort of assess people? So just going back to, I guess, the attraction side of things, I think data has been really, really helpful for anything that I've done at any of the firms I've been at, including when I was at Rare as well. And I think that just knowing which campuses you're going to, who are there, who is there, what the profile is, was super helpful. I think in terms of what happens on campus, and I've neglected to mention that having alternative routes is also really helpful here. We'll talk about that a bit more later. Is really helpful. So a lot of sponsorship, certainly in law, would tend to go to law societies. So really thinking about actually, are there cultural groups or other groups that you might be able to give help to, help in kind as well. That might actually just introduce you to a slightly different group of talent. I think COVID-19 has actually been a blessing in some respects, because I think it's forced people to do different events. So I think a lot of people have moved away from the plenary type session where everyone comes in and we learn about how wonderful your firm or your organisation is and how many offices you have in different countries. I think there's definitely a sense in which actually what young people need is something that engages them, that's something that educates them. And so some of the firms that I've worked with, we've worked really hard to work with our L&D teams to actually have a curriculum that underpins what's going on campus, that actually feeds into the ongoing learning that they'll need to do once they're through the door as well. And I think that's been really helpful in terms of looking at not just the nuts and bolts of what people do in the job, but also thinking about health and well-being issues and how they cope with those and how they make the most of the opportunities that are in front of them as well. I think in terms of events specifically, I know that some of the events that I've run at Rare and also in-house, little things have made a difference, whether it's with food, see pre-COVID and hopefully past COVID, what kind of food we have. I think also just letting people know that there's a prayer room. I think the number of eyes that lit up at an event where I just mentioned that if you need to, this is where it is, was astounding. And I think those little bits that are almost a counterpoint to the microaggressions, which I think we talk about, you talk about in a lot of your research, are the things that will show people that this isn't just a target that sits at the top. Actually, this is a feeling, the feeling of inclusion is something that everyone lives and breathes. And then I guess the final point, because there is a lot, and I think ISE members recognise it, is really sort of thinking about who goes on campus and equally how that time is recognised. So it's all well and good having your I won't say diverse candidates because I don't like the phrase, but your people from underrepresented groups going out on campus, but particularly in places where your time is billed and they are spending time off desk, making sure that that doesn't then penalise them in terms of how they're perceived by whoever's on their desk, or indeed their access to opportunities is super, super important. So encouraging all people, not just underrepresented people, to be on campus to talk about the D&I story and its relevance to them personally, but also the firm, but also making sure that that total contribution to organisations is recognised is really, really important.
Yeah, thank you. And then Claire, maybe to follow sort of Andre's logic as we think about early career progression and to build on Tim's earlier comments about progression, talk to us a bit about your experience of this, what organisations can be doing once they have attracted the best talent, as Stephen was describing earlier, what then needs to happen to make sure everyone can thrive?
Yeah, I'm gonna slightly change that question if you don't mind, Nick. I think there's a stage pre bringing the students in or the talent into a business. Hopefully you can all, I think I've frozen, but hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, I've got a nod, thanks. Thanks. Yeah, but the stage before you're bringing that talent into the business. So when people start their diversity and inclusion journey, so let's just go and get diverse talent. I actually think consider whether your current infrastructure and frameworks will actually set that talent up to succeed. So, what I mean by that in a tangible way is sometimes, we look at performance mechanisms by measuring who's got the biggest connections, the most connections, and is the biggest revenue generator. Well, actually, the individual that's from a low socioeconomic group with no connections, that's first generation, first into a profession of any kind, won't have that kind of capital. So I think rework the kind of frameworks that you're looking for that will, forgive me, Andre, but set diverse people up to succeed in your businesses. And again, we should use underrepresented, but so change the framework. And then I think there's plenty I could say, but I think don't assume it will just happen by luck would be my other observation. So if we care about this underrepresented talent, Andre, I'm gonna go with your term. If we care about this underrepresented talent, then make it stick. So and a really practical way of doing that would be mentoring. So give people mentors to help them to understand the ways of navigating business, because they don't, again, have anybody in their networks that they can learn from. So I guess don't just assume it can happen. So it kind of takes a fair amount of investment, but I'm saying change the framework and then put practical interventions in place to make it stick.
Great, thanks Claire. And then Tim, if I may turn to you, whether we're talking about attraction or selection, or as Claire was there, early career progression, we found in lots of our research these really important connections between race and socioeconomic background. And just to echo my earlier comment that we're very mindful never to conflate the two. What's your sort of experience in that space, and what do those relationships mean in terms of practice and practical actions that can be done in this space?
So you set the scene for this, Nick, by talking about intersectionality of data at the beginning, and how we shouldn't be looking at socioeconomic background as distinct from race, as distinct from gender, religion, disability, and the like. And certainly one of the things that we found, my firm, BCLP, we target our initiatives at socioeconomic background and race at the same time. And the reason for that is if you strip it back and we're looking at the disadvantages that those sections of our applicant community suffer from, they're essentially the same. They are access to fewer people who have undertaken the journey and can therefore give people meaningful careers advice about how you enter the legal profession, what life at university might be like. And then a similar point is that there are fewer identifiable role models there who can inspire people to say, well, if Andre's been able to achieve this, then I want to be like Andre. And he talks about a very fulfilling career. I want some of that for me as well. But I think there's also a sense to which the sort of circles in which people who come from a more advantaged background move in does confer on them advantages in the recruitment and the promotion processes at firms. And if I could just give just one example of something that BCLP is doing to try and tackle that. When you talk to potential applicants for a training contract, in our case, the thing that terrifies all of them, no matter what background they come from, is this ability to demonstrate commercial awareness, to be able to talk the commercial game. And no matter where you are in professional services, that is always a factor which is prized at some stage. Now, if you move in circles where you don't have the type of economic, political conversations around the dinner table, because that's just not the sort of opportunity which is available to you, then being pitched into a situation where you imagine that you're going to be asked about the latest headline in the FT is a terrifyingly alien environment for them to be in. One of the things that we've begun to do in order to try and break that down is to launch for our more diverse candidates something called Commercial Cafe. And the Commercial Cafe is an online platform where we bring together students from lower socioeconomic groups talking to associates and partners in the law firm just about commercial topics. We will select the topics and we'll say to people, what do you think about this? What do you think about the state of the US elections? What do you think about the impact of COVID on the UK economy, the impact of Brexit on the UK economy? And what you do then is you present them with a forgiving environment at which they can practice some of the commercial discussion skills that they maybe haven't had the opportunity to do because of the upbringing and the circles that they've moved in. So it's identifying what it is about these candidates that puts them at a disadvantage to those with higher socioeconomic backgrounds, and try and do something to redress that balance.
And then Tim, as the lawyer in the room, as it were, I can't resist asking you the question then following from that, whether part of what you're describing there is an argument for making socioeconomic background a protected characteristic, which of course it isn't currently. Your view on that?
That's a really tough one, and I've done some soul searching on it. Superficially, it looks like it should be a good idea because bringing it within the cadre of protected characteristics, if nothing else, signals the importance of it, and it requires a focus on this characteristic in the way that one is required to focus on gender and race and sexual orientation and religion and the like. My personal view is there are probably more factors weighing against it than in favour of it. And just one or two of those, if you start with a basic one, I can't help as a lawyer thinking about, if you're going to create a regulatory and statutory obligation around this, then you've got to be able to define it right. How do you define socioeconomic background so as to give people an idea of what it is that they're required to comply with? But I think there's another factor as well, which is, it seems to me as though there's a risk that if you create something as a legislative requirement, you might actually stifle the sort of innovation that we are seeing. There are some initiatives, and Andre's mentioned RARE. RARE is at the forefront of contextual recruitment, which a number of sectors will use. It could be that once you invite socioeconomic background into the group of protected characteristics, those kind of things become more difficult to do. But my concern is also that if you create it as a regulatory hurdle, then you might force people to just do the lowest common denominator. They tick the regulatory compliance box and won't go beyond that because there's no incentive for them to go beyond that. And my personal view is that if you can foster best practice, maybe backed up by some regulatory compulsion, but falling short of legislation, then you're actually going to produce some of the best results on that. So I've gone from a position where it looked attractive to lifting the lid on it and realizing that possibly it could not be the right thing to do. And I see Andre smiling, and to be fair to him, this is a view that Andre has harbored right from the start. So I'm flocking to your banner on this one, Andre.
Andre, thanks so much. There's one last question I'd like to ask, which is just for you to share with attendees, just a quick practical tip. But maybe, Stephen, that should be our closing question. And in the meantime, maybe just to turn to you for any views you want to share on this and to put any questions from attendees to the panel. Thank you.
Definitely. So we've had quite a few questions coming through. Some of them have been kind of covered, and some of them I'll sort of paraphrase into one. I think before, Andre, you started talking about how what more employers could do on campus. We had a few questions around that, and just to reiterate something you said, Nick, the regulatory regime has changed with the Office for Students. I think historically universities were much more focused on who gets into universities rather than necessarily progression, and they're not now. There's a bit of carrot and stick, which I think is a great opportunity for employers to weave together much more this transitions from education into work. A question on actually that came early on, and I think you mentioned this word, Tim, and it was around equality and equity. And the question from Sharon was saying that this word equity is a rising word in the D&I conversation, and I'm definitely hearing it more as well. So and the question was keen to understand how we can capitalize on this and move the agenda forward. So does anybody like to talk a bit more about that word equity and what it means, and how that might change the focus of what we're doing?
Can I maybe have a go with that one first, Stephen, very quickly? I think part of equity is visibility. It's being able to show people that your talent has been enough to allow you to succeed. And so a critical part of demonstrating equity is to be able to show as many good case studies and as many personal stories as possible, because people come from, have so many different facets to their personality and to their background that just offering them one or two stories is unlikely to resonate with them. But the more stories that you offer, the more likely it is that somebody will be able to identify with the experience and the journey that somebody has been on. And if they can see that there is somebody who shares an awful lot of characteristics with them, who has been able to progress through the ranks and achieve some success and some seniority, then I think that's a visible demonstration of equity at work, and I think that's critically important to be able to show that.
I think for me that also opens up a more general point. My understanding is equality means treating everyone equally. Equity means giving everyone sort of equal access to opportunities that help you get ahead. And it reminds me of that awful phrase, you know, I'm blind to race. You know, we seem to explore that in some detail. But I think it comes back to conversations we have with employers often about what's the task at hand here. Is it about helping underrepresented groups kind of fit in better and get ahead, that sort of deficit model? Or is it about challenging a dominant culture and structures, Claire, as you mentioned earlier, that are set up to advantage particular people over others? And those structures have traditionally been established by white affluent men, of course. So I think that often we'll say to employers, what's the task at hand here? Are you trying to give a few underrepresented people a sort of leg up? Or is this actually about thinking about what dominant cultures enable people to do and what it enables them not to do?
I think, yeah, I agree. I think there's a real opportunity on that front. I think there's also an opportunity around actually making what makes candidates from underrepresented groups unique a virtue in terms of actually what are they bringing in. The deficit model is very much giving people a leg up so they are at the same level as other people. But I think the more you can do that, the better. I think the firms that often have maybe a regional incentive to do that because they have offices or sites up and down the country, and also need and therefore need local sort of local talent pools, or those who have regional focuses. So at Linklaters we did a lot of international work, so I was also responsible for the hiring for the work we did in Africa and India, for instance. If they have that, then that actually can be a real driver for actually why you really need this talent, because you ultimately are serving clients who have that who are from those areas as well. So I think making sure that that you see everyone's strengths in the round is really important, and that actually the firm has an ongoing learning sort of commitment, so that it's not just people from underrepresented groups who need remedial work. It's also individuals from other backgrounds who also need support to understand that there are other ways of doing things as well.
I've had a question here talking about actually the selection process and monitoring adverse impact in that selection process, but a bit of an open question here. Does anybody think it can actually ever be eliminated, or is it something that we're always going to be actively managing it in some way or other?
I think, so Claire, you've probably got lots of views on this as well, but certainly from my side, having sort of helped to change the selection process and also sort of advised on changes elsewhere, I think it's going to be an ongoing piece of work, and you always have to be quite vigilant. And I think particularly at this time where I think probably most firms have probably experienced an uptick in the number of applications they've received during this period, partly because young people are at home and have less to do and have applied probably more proactively than they might have at other times. There's a temptation with technology to find some way of managing the numbers in some way, shape or form through the use of technology. And I think AI can be useful, but AI is very much based on what happens in the past, and therefore using that as an indication of what happens in the future. At some point in a selection process, you're going to have to take a perceived risk and have to find a way of assessing what potential looks like rather than what past experience it is. So I think the best and the most progressive firms have kind of learnt that and made sure that whether they're using a balanced scorecard, elements of blind recruitment, contextual recruitment, all these different things which some people see as a panacea, they're not without good training. That actually with all of these things, they're ultimately going to have to make a decision as to who they feel has the potential to be a success. And actually, as Claire said, making sure that the frameworks, once they're in, be it through L&D or the structures of how they're managed, are such that they can actually be supported in the right sort of way. So I'd say selection processes are much about assessing the right candidates and for their potential and their current ability, as much as it is about being realistic about what capacity the firm has to actually support them to reach that potential.
Just a quick build from me, and Andre's given a super comprehensive answer, and probably, yeah, he and I are on a not dissimilar page. I think without sounding, you know, like a broken record, don't go into a recruitment process until you're confident that the criteria you're looking for, you've looked to minimize as much of the bias as possible. And that is, you know, a framework that has got equality at its heart, and there's a recognition of equity and differentials there. I think I'm hopeful, because you have to be in the diversity and inclusion space, that with a robust framework and training that André said, and clear briefing, you can minimize bias and therefore hopefully maximize objectivity in your recruitment process. I would caution, I think André was saying, I would caution against tech tools, or just understand the tech tool before engaging in a tech tool, because I've seen a good number of poorly executed technology tools, and AI being deemed the answer. But if it's modelled based on a non-diverse workforce, then all it's going to do is keep spitting out more of the same. So caution on tech, but obviously equally us as human beings are biased. So, but hopefully you can, through a robust process, you can minimise it.
I've had another couple of questions here that touch on actually the dominant groups and where they might feel either consciously or unconsciously threatened. And another question actually talking about sort of goodwill, awareness of employees to change. Is there anything anybody like to say around actually how do you tackle those issues? I mean, I can think of examples where I've, you know, doing the job I do, you know, you're at an event and so and talks, and I can think of, I won't embarrass the organisation's name. It wasn't a law firm, by the way, but a large graduate recruiter. This was somebody in the business unit who was pretty derogatory around doing anything around social mobility, hated contextualised data, and said, I just asked the questions to find out the information I want in the first place and focus on Russell Group students, etc., etc. You can imagine the conversation. So I'm sure there is all this. There are these. This is a question of culture and these dominant groups. Has anybody got any thoughts about how you tackle that, or is it something that just, you know, constantly keeping the conversation going will in a sense drive the change that we need, or is there something that I guess more targeted or more proactive needs to be done, or even making people more accountable?
I would just open with a point echoed from earlier, Stephen. I certainly think lots of our work focuses on, I'll choose my words slightly carefully, but sort of enlightening the majority group rather than supporting an underrepresented group. I think changes in that space will be much more progressive. And I think the echo is around the data. I think arming people with evidence, as we referenced earlier, the peace and the legal profession, is pretty hard to ignore, actually. You know, we get grilled on statistical significance and rigor, and it always reassures me when people want to investigate things with that level of rigor. So I think arming people with the evidence is the first step.
I think one very quick anecdote to add to help explain my answer to this question, Stephen. I participated in an event a few years ago where I interviewed on stage Alison Nimmo, who's the former chief executive of the Crown Estate and was also involved in London 2012. And we'd pre-prepared the questions that I was going to ask her beforehand so that she was able to give a comprehensive answer to all of them. But one of them was, can you tell us about somebody in your career who's really inspired you that you'd like to thank for helping you on your journey? And she said, well, I'm going to name two, and of those two, one was a woman and one was a man. And she turned to her audience, which was about 90% female, because that was the organisation who'd arranged it. And she said, because you can't do this without them. You can't do this without some buy-in from the dominant culture. In this case, it was women looking to break into management positions within real estate, for whom the dominant culture is certainly has been very much male. But she said you've got to bring them with you, otherwise you're never going to get there, or it's going to take you, infinitely longer to do that. So that would be part of my answer to that question. The dominant culture shouldn't feel threatened by this. But there are aspects that the dominant culture understand that can be used to give that leg up. I forget who used the term, André, I think, to people who are in need of some help for the diversity deficit.
Just a really quick reflection from me is a quote from John Amici, who we've been lucky enough to have in our business, and he said, "Inclusion is not out to get mediocre people." So if you're good enough, you'll succeed here. All we're doing is leveling the playing field, full stop. There has been data you could prove that certain groups have been advantaged before. And all we're doing is leveling the playing field, and inclusion is not out to get mediocre people.
Claire, I'd echo that very quickly. Lots of our evidence says that the tolerance of mediocre performance amongst the majority group is an important piece of this jigsaw.
Nick, one final question. I think you had a final question you were going to ask everybody, and it's on the international aspect. So are you seeing any of your work being picked up in other countries, or other countries looking at this? I know I do a little bit internationally, and it's not always a topic of conversation. So how about answering that one and then posing the last question that you're going to pose to round us off?
Shall I have a go at this one first, Stephen? Because you know, but other delegates may not, that the BCLP is an international law firm, and about 3 years ago we merged with a US firm, so our presence in the United States is now as large as it is in Europe, Middle East and Asia. What I've found is certainly initiatives to do with race are as prominent in the US and worldwide as they are in the UK. They might be targeted slightly differently. They might start from a lower base in different parts of the world. The one thing which has surprised me, though, is when I've talked about socioeconomic background and social inclusivity with colleagues in the US, their starting point has always been, oh, we don't do anything like that here. And then when you start to break it down, they do still provide bursaries and sponsorship to, as they would call it, failing schools. They do still bring in the kids from Harlem into the office in Manhattan, just so they can see that. And what you discover is they are doing the same kind of things. They're just not calling it social inclusivity. So that I took to be a validation of how this thing can cross international boundaries.
Yeah, I think from my side, having worked on some global programs, there's been a lot of cross-fertilization between our the experiences in the UK and elsewhere. I think South Africa was probably the most interesting place in terms of its approach to ethnicity, but also, I guess, the very close correlation, the closer correlation there between socioeconomics and ethnicity. Same with the States, and my experience of the States is the same. Certainly the Making Links brands that I helped or I launched over at Linklaters has been something that's been adopted in other locations, including Asia Pacific. And I think there is a recognition that there is quite a lot of sort of, there are a lot of similarities, but ultimately some local decisions need to be made as to how it actually manifests itself in that particular market.
I'm reminded, Stephen, briefly of some work I've been doing over the last few years at the University of Helsinki in Finland, where someone, in wrapping up after I'd delivered a speech, said, well, here in Finland, equity is not an agenda, it's not an initiative, it's a way to ensure we all stay happy. So that's an aspirational maybe to finish on. Stephen, my last question was just, on the panel here, we've got colleagues who are deeply thoughtful and experienced, but also who are very practical. And I know attendees are often keen to leave with a sort of practical tips as well, many of which have been shared already, but I wonder if that's a last question just to end on.
Good one. Who'd like to go first with their practical tips for I was going to say practical success? That sounds so cheesy, but you know what I mean. Who'd like to go first?
Okay, I'll try if that's all right. I think the first thing I would always encourage people to do is map your processes. Actually know what your processes are from start to finish, and then monitor them. And I think everyone's recognised that. And then actually be happy with making incremental changes to them year on year to make that real difference. So if you do all of those things and actually you allow time for that in your busy year plans, then I think you can actually get closer to making sure that your processes don't disadvantage people, and that actually you are spending more time supporting individuals to be the best they can be, whether from a majority or minority group.
Thanks, Andre.
I'll go next. Yeah, I'm going to try and go cheeky with two because it's really hard to say one. Work that I did when I was working with Tim in the law firm, and then here, open up access. So we both in the previous place and then here at JLL, we've got work experience program for exactly the demographic that we are talking about today. So if you want to change this, go and engage with some young people and give them the first-hand experience of what it is like to work in your profession. And then that becomes the pipeline to apply for apprenticeships or onto graduate programs, etc. And then my second quick one, if you don't mind, but it's just this, the role models piece. Use whatever diversity or underrepresented people you've got in your business to help to attract the next generation of underrepresented talent. So role models, with that view that you need to see it to be it. So when you're engaging with young people, use the people that you've underrepresented talent that you've already got to help to bring that next gen in.
So I'll conclude, and I'll nicely bookend the presentation then by harking back to something that that Nick began with, which is there's no substitute for a richness of data here. And what we've spent a lot of time talking about is quantitative data, but there's also the qualitative aspect to data as well, which I know in the various reports that Nick has done has been equally a focus as the quantitative data. But what that means is things like talking to people about their experience of a recruitment process, a promotion process, exit interviews with people who've left the business, just to understand why that's happened. Because put simply, until you can diagnose the problem, you can't proceed to the cure. And so the data, the quantitative data might be suggesting that there is a problem, but the qualitative data is the thing that will help you to hone in on what that problem is. And only then can you start to take steps to alter the culture incrementally so that it becomes a more welcoming and inclusive culture for the people that you want to retain. So data, 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 but qualitative as well as quantitative.
And Nick, is there anything you'd add to that list of tips?
No, that all sounds wonderfully sensible to me, Stephen. I think I've shared some views. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much. Well, that was a really rich conversation. We've overrun by nearly 10 minutes, which shows how engaging the conversation was and how engaged our audience is. Apologies, I didn't get to all the questions. There were a whole chunk of them that came through, so I was trying to group them all together. This is a really important topic for us at the ISE, as I mentioned up front. And just a demonstration of that is we had one of my first calls this morning was with our various sector champions. And when I was asking what do we need to do more on, the very first thing that people came back with was actually around the social mobility agenda. So it is definitely something we will be coming back to. At our HE conference that's coming on the 24th of March, you'll get the chance to see André again. So André will be joining us where we've got another session there, very much tackling this issue. So thank you again for your time. So Claire, André, Tim and Nick, really appreciate your time. I understand how busy everybody is. So thank you very much. And I'm sure we will keep the conversation going on from here. Talk to you all soon. Enjoy the snow if you've got snow where you are. If not, I suspect it might be heading your way looking at the weather forecast. So talk to everyone soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.